Tonight's talk is called Spotlight on Teen Mental Health. Per the U.S. Surgeon General, right now, young people are struggling with the highest rates of depression and anxiety. Please welcome Dr. Sicher and Suraiya Simi Rahman as they talk about the current state of teen mental health, what they are seeing specifically in their practices, and what you can do to help your child. Dr. Sicher, sorry so much, Sarah, is an adult and child adolescent psychiatrist. She did her fellowship training at USC and is currently an adjunct faculty in the Department of Psychiatry there. She has a private practice in South Pasadena and does a lot of work with younger kids, teens, young adults, and mental health. Suraiya Simi Rahman, MD, is a pediatrician who has 20 plus years of experience in outpatient and inpatient care, most recently at LAC and USC. She has been part of the South Pasadena community with two children who started out at AV. In 2022, she opened her private practice in Pasadena, offering integrative and alternative therapies for mental health disorders in adults and adolescents. So we're going to start with Dr. Sarah first. Sarah. There we go.
There we go. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Better? Okay. I'm gonna start with, I have a bit of a cold and maybe coughing. I have some tea and cough drops here, but I'll try to get through this. So can I do the slides, or are you gonna do them, Kristen?
I was gonna do the slides, so if you just want to tell me.
All right, so if you want to switch over to the next slide. So I'm going to just introduce myself a little bit. Thank you for the introduction. So as Kristen said, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I work in South Pasadena. I see a lot of teenagers. I also have more recently done some training in psychedelic assisted psychotherapies, and I'm the second year clinical associate at the new Center for Psychoanalysis. So I'm very interested in kind of that world. But today we're going to talk, I want to talk about the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory on youth mental health. And because we're talking about that, we're talking about a lot of generalities. And so I'm actually going to try to keep things like pretty brief to talk about what the Surgeon General's advisory was about and what it said and what it brought up, because I actually think that the richness will come in the questions, and maybe more specificity will come in the questions. So we're going to talk about the advisory. I'm going to give a little bit on the state of affairs of youth mental health nationally. I want to talk a little bit about spheres of influence. I think it is pertinent, and then how might this look? And again, lots of time for questions. So we can go on to the next slide. So what does the U.S. Surgeon General say? So just a little background, the Surgeon General's office issues an advisory. An advisory is a public statement that calls the American people's attention to an urgent public health issue and provides recommendations for how it should be addressed. Advisories are reserved for significant public health challenges that need the nation's immediate awareness and action. So the language in it is like of immediacy. Like, this is a big problem that needs to be talked about and needs to be addressed. So in 2021, the U.S. Surgeon General issued an advisory called Protecting Youth Mental Health. It's a 53-page document. You can get it online. It's public access. And it outlines the scope of youth mental health concerns, and this is particularly post-COVID, and recommendations. And then more recently, in June of 2023, there was a second advisory that was released called Social Media and Youth Mental Health, about the relationship between social media use, consumption, potential risks, and interactions with mental health concerns. That was a shorter advisory, but I think much more interesting in certain ways. There may be more questions about that one, perhaps. So some of the Surgeon General's advisory take-home points from the first one were things like recognize that mental health is an essential part of overall health, empowering youth and families to recognize, manage, and learn from difficult emotions, ensure access to high-quality, affordable, culturally competent care, support the mental health of children in educational, community, and childcare settings, address barriers, and a lot of stuff about increasing resources for research so that we can learn more about this. You can go to the next slide. So from the second advisory on social media, some of the take-home points were that social media usage is ubiquitous. So it's nearly universal in young people. So up to 95% of teens 13 to 17 report using social media. Out of those, 23 or 2/3 of those reported using social media every day, and a third reported using it nearly constantly throughout the day. Their take from this advisory was that social media presents a meaningful risk of harm to youth while also providing benefits. And we can conclude that social media usage, we cannot conclude that social media usage is safe for children and adolescents. So just to like fill this in a little bit more, some of the risks that they're talking about here were around the relationship between social media use and sleep deprivation. The idea that in some ways this is like a large experiment, like we don't have a lot of data on what exposing a developing brain to this level of content and stimulation that's designed to be reinforcing, like what that would do to brain development. And then a lot of questions around like, is social media usage linked with higher rates of depression and anxiety? And there is some data to point to the fact that it may be. And then this We Can Take Action part, really, there was a lot in that advisory around policymakers, tech companies, and researchers trying to be more mindful about striking this balance of getting product out and content out, and also trying to learn more about the effect that this is having. And then there was some in there about advice for parents and caregivers and schools and adolescents. Yeah. So a little bit about the state of affairs. So when we hear this sort of public health crisis, public health, like this is an urgent issue, like what's going on actually? And what can we think about? So the CDC has published some really impactful reports. In 2021, it published data from large national population surveys that was from like 2011 to 2021, particularly looking at US teenagers. In 2021, more than 40% of students felt persistently sad or hopeless. Nearly 29% experienced what they called poor mental health. In 2021, more than 1 in 5 students, 22%, seriously considered attempting suicide, and 1 in 10% attempted suicide. Certain groups were more at risk. So girls were at higher risk for feeling persistently sad and hopeless, and girls were at a higher risk for having seriously considered suicide. And other groups like LGBTQ+, Hispanic, Black, and multiracial students were at a higher risk for depression as well as for suicide attempts. The NIMH, which is the National Institute for Mental Health, found that nearly 50% of US teens had experienced a mental health disorder at some point in their lives. And according to Mental Health America, is like a data company, over 15% of youth experienced a major depressive disorder in the past year. I think this was from 2021. Nationally, 60% of youth with major depression did not receive mental health treatment. So that's saying that like the rates of depression are high, and over half of people who have depression aren't being treated. So even in states with greater access, California is a state with greater access, still only 33%, still 33% were not receiving care. So it's a common problem, and it's not being recognized or treated enough. So currently suicide is in the top 3 leading causes of death for teens. That was not the way it was. That's a newer development. It used to be lower. And the issue that mental health issues are deeply intertwined with all sorts of realms of functioning and development. So social functioning, academic functioning, overall medical health, family functioning, and that there are really complex relationships between stress, support, resiliency, coping, and mental health, and like how does it all fit together? So why am I talking about this at a PTA meeting? I'm talking about this at a PTA meeting because of where school fits into the picture. So there may be some of you in the audience who are familiar with Brenner's ecological systems model, which sounds way fancier than it actually is. But basically, it's an idea that was developed around child development, in that a child follows a development sorry, a development trajectory, but they do it within the contexts of certain sort of spheres of influence. So there's a child, immediate family members who's in the home, and then the circle widens out, right? Like friends, neighbors, and then school is like a really, really important part of the sphere of influence. So when we're talking about something like a public health crisis or public health, a major issue of public health concern, thinking about how these sort of levels, spheres of influence can interact and be a part of this, I think is important. Go to the next slide. So this is from the, sorry, it came out really blurry, but this is from the first Surgeon General's advisory, but it says similar graphical representation of the idea that I'm trying to get at. So school falls somewhere between like community environment, right? So schools occupy an important sphere of influence. So when we're talking about the mental health crisis, I think we're incompletely talking about it if we're not including how schools are involved. So what does this look like? So I'm very aware of not wanting to wade into any sort of political, specific, complicated politics, but I think in some level it goes back to the advisory initial recommendation. So recognizing that mental health is an essential part of overall health. And that would look like supporting environments to incorporate and prioritize social emotional learning and psychoeducation, and integrating it into general education. In other words, it's not a carved out special interest for a small portion of the student population, but something that the entire community is involved in and participating in. And that takes a lot of resourcing to accomplish that. So that looks like resourcing and education for students, parents, other caregivers, teachers, administrators. Go to the next slide. So just a few quick tidbits about resourcing. I'm an advocate that everybody have the suicide hotline number programmed in their phone. I am also an advocate that everybody have the Trevor Project hotline number, which is a LGBTQ 24 hours a day hotline number, free, that people can call if they need support. The CDC website has really great information about the sort of interaction between parents and schools and how to support some of these conversations. There's a toolkit for schools, stuff around school connectedness and positive youth development. And the National Center on Safe Supportive Learning Environments has some great resources around family school community partnerships that can help facilitate these sorts of initiatives. And that's all I have actually, which I know is somewhat incomplete, but I wanted to leave a lot of room for questions and kind of see where the questions lead us.
That's all good. We're gonna then go over to Dr. Simi. And let me spotlight her. And then we'll take questions at the end after both of you have spoken, if that's great. Thanks so much, Sarah. You did great. Sorry about your throat.
I think it's going around. I think I have something to. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah, for such a great presentation. I just want to invite everybody to just take a little breath. It's a lot when we're talking about this, and I invite you to just kind of shake that off. I'm going to give you a pediatrician's view. And I understand that we're talking about a problem that has many different dimensions and some that are larger than we can grapple with at this level. And so for my presentation, I'd like to talk about the evidence for what solving this problem at the school and community level can look like. And thank you, Sarah, for laying that out so perfectly. And I appreciate Principal Eldred's emphasis on the importance of connectedness and the efforts to upskill the staff that we heard about earlier. That is amazing. And I think just being able to talk about this topic at this level, at this granularity, is really wonderful. So thank you for this forum. So my view is that I think mental health is a team sport. There's a relational model involved. As Dr. Sicher mentioned, the child is an expression of the family unit. and that adults around them model mental health and coping skills. So absolutely agree that if we're going to make any changes, this has to be more comprehensive changes that adults and students can adopt. As we know, child development is an unfolding process. And then in that unfolding process, we have critical periods for development. And we know that social emotional learning was impacted during the pandemic because of the switch to a digital platform, and that the rates at which our children went to the increase in the number of hours a day that they were spending on screens just skyrocketed within a very short period of time. So as we all lived through that, we know what that meant at the time. And of course, child development is impacted by large-scale trauma. So thinking of the pandemic, the climate, anything else that's happening in the world that's impacting us. But there's also this idea of post-traumatic growth, which is supported by the neuroscience of resilience, which points to this opportunity for intervention. So there's a lot of science out there that shows us how to engage with this problem, how to think about it, and what kind of opportunities become available. Where shall we point our attention, and what shall we pour our resources into? And as we were talking about, if we think of the holistic model of well-being, the human being in context, everything matters. So when we're, next slide, please. So when we're kind of talking about what it is that we're tackling here, this slide really nails it. I can't do anything right. My life is not useful. I do not enjoy life. These are, statements made by children, and as you can see, the numbers just went up. And Kristen, if you go ahead and tap it one more time, you'll see that there was an inflection point here in 2007, which is when the iPhone was released. And then the next inflection point will be, as you would expect, during the pandemic. And so we're talking about the scale of the problem that means that this is why we have to talk about it at the school district level. That's why we have to talk about this at the family level, because it's just we don't have the resources to deal with something like this. We're already dealing with a very strained mental health network in this country, and with this idea that what we're dealing with right now is a consequence of this feeling of disconnection. We know that right now children are reporting, schools are reporting the lowest percentage of feeling connected to school, feeling connected to another adult in their life. Oops, that just disappeared. But I can keep talking. When we're connected to other people, we co-regulate. That's when we learn from our individual connections, from the relationships around us. All of this is impacted by the digital platforms. Some of the impacts of disconnection fall on graduation rates, addiction rates, social anxiety, mental health. The National Association of the State Boards of Education, and their Centering School Connectedness advisory said that during the pandemic, high school students who said that there was an adult at school who knew and cared about them reported 40% fewer mental health challenges. And students said that the intervention they valued most was having a champion check in with them weekly to support their goals. So connection matters, and the fact that the digital platforms that we've moved over to have actually made us feel more connected, even as they drive this disconnection, is an area of rich research, as Dr. Sicher mentioned. Next slide, please. This is one piece that I want to emphasize always as a pediatrician, that we forget that a lot of what's happening in our bodies, in our mind-body systems as human beings, is with this disconnection from nature. And so I was way too late in my professional life when I read this book called Last Child in the Woods. And so I always bring it up because I deeply regretted not reading this earlier than I did, so that I could apply it more to my children. So if anybody's looking for what connection looks like from that perspective of the environment, I recommend that book. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk a little bit about why this matters in school. We know that learning and stress do not mix in a lot of ways. So on the left side, you'll see the unstressed brain. You'll see that there's lots of signals from the prefrontal cortex. So lots of good regulation of your thoughts, emotions, and actions. And in a stressed brain, because of the amygdala activation, the prefrontal cortex gets hijacked. And so the name of the book was Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv, Louv. So that prefrontal cortex gets hijacked, and so there's not a sense of safety. And when we have that constant state of stress, the increased cortisol, chronic stress, that impacts the brain structure, and that's what leads to learning difficulties and ADHD-like symptoms like lack of focus, executive function issues, and impulsivity. And so, next slide. So some of what we know about how stress works, and I don't know if you can see, there's two separate sides to this next slide. What I really wanted to emphasize in that figure on that right side is when you look at brain health and mental health, um, and you look at it holistically, there are so many parts that are involved. But here on that left side, you'll see that social interaction, emotion, cognition, layered on top of lifestyle choices like sleep, food, exercise, layered on top of epigenetics. And then on that right side, environmental factors like socioeconomic disparities, pollutants, discrimination, what's happening biologically, and then what's happening in on the brain level. All those factors can really impact how a disease expresses itself. So next slide. So what they talk about with adolescents is this thing called the critical period, because we know that adolescent brains are much more vulnerable at this time to stress itself. We know that in early life, depending on how many stressors you had versus how many protective factors you have, the stress response itself can increase the risk or decrease the risk for psychopathology. So what you'll see here is that an adolescent brain in its very critical period of development goes through a stressor. And because there were some early life stressors that were high and that they had lower protective factors, the stress response creates an increased risk for psychopathology. On the next slide, what you'll see is that you have a brain that has the same early life stressors, but then has the protective factors. And then we know that the stress response can be mitigated to the point where it has a reduced risk for psychopathology. So what does that mean? So there are things that we know we can do to actually mitigate this stress response on learning and on mental health. Next slide, please. So we know that peer groups, and then the next slide, relationships, can really matter when it comes to what we need to do, to bolster this kind of environment for that social emotional learning to take place, to decrease those stressors. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about what we're doing here when it comes to mitigating those risks, but providing those protective factors, social emotional learning models like CASEL and others can actually help us to understand what it means to give parents, administrators, children the skills that they need to in the classroom, within their families and within their communities, and really be able to develop some of those protective resilience skills. This would obviously need some well-informed interventions at various levels, and lots of schools have started to actually put in place some of these programs. And so it would need trained educators, parent and community involvement, emotional regulation spaces where children can go ahead and de-stress and feel safe, and to have this be a data-driven improvement cycle where each school district, each school does continue to pay attention to this piece. And some of the metrics that we can look at are school connectedness, how how well resourced are the children? Are people seeking help for mental health resources without that stigma that can be connected to it? So actually increasing the usage of mental health resources because they can detect when they need it instead of waiting for too long. So I'm going to let it rest there. That last slide that I have is a lot of my resources that I use to talk together. I hope this just gave full scope understanding of where we can direct our resources, and I'll stop for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. The last slide does have a lot of resources on it. So when we send out the video for this, I will also put those resources in the YouTube channel comments so that you guys can see that when that happens. So now we have time for questions. If anybody has any questions, we would love to take your questions. In the meantime, if any of you missed Mr. Eldred's talk at the beginning of the PTA meeting, he did talk about school connectedness and belonging as being part of what they are working on this year. They are working on that at the professional development days, both I mean, maybe Mr. Eldred could say more because we now are recording this and people might see it later. But they're working on it at the professional development days and both at the beginning of this month and at the end of this month, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's nice to see what Sarah and Simi are saying, that it lines up with what we have identified as, something that's key for our kids that not necessarily has been lacking, but maybe something that we haven't paid as much attention to as we should. We're high performing school and a high performing district, and we get so focused on academics, and we need to remember that that there's a person in there that wants to be resilient, for example, just needs to be made to feel that that they are connected to the adult that's asking them to be resilient, and that there's a relationship there that the adult cares about, that the student can benefit from, and that care is present, that really makes the student feel like they can perform to the best of their ability and really become the best version of themselves they possibly can.
Sorry, I was muted. That's fantastic. Thank you, John, so much. I do have one question. I'm not sure who this goes to, but somebody asked if they do have a child who is, let me just word it the right way. If they do have a child that is kind of needs to see a therapist, but doesn't, they've have some adults in their lives that don't really, that they connect with, but they really are kind of at a mental health state where they need to see a therapist, but they don't feel comfortable with that because they don't feel connected to that therapist, because of course, how can you feel connected to someone you don't know? Do you have any recommendations on how to encourage a child to do that if you can actually find a therapist for them to see?
I'm wondering if we could clarify the question a little bit more. That the child would be willing to connect with the therapist, but
the child is pulling, it sounds like the child is pulling back from wanting to see a therapist, even though they know they should, because of not feeling connected. So it's not really a school connection thing. It's kind of an outside of that, but I think because.
So I think that is a tricky one, because I'm gonna make an analogy that is a little dicey, but you'll see the point I'm making. I think that therapy, it's a fit thing, and it's a little bit like dating, in the sense of like, there's got to be some natural like comfortableness, right? Like not it may be that the child doesn't feel connected to the therapist because there isn't really a natural good fit between them. One thing I talk with families a lot about is this idea of continuing to be open-minded, that like if that one meeting, that one therapist like wasn't the right one, or wasn't the right fit at the right time, like continuing to be open-minded, that doesn't mean that you can't find connection with somebody else, but maybe it's about like just continuing to try things until something feels right.
Yeah. Okay, great.
I'd like to also add that sometimes the inability to connect can be that the person has such severe symptoms, um, of depression that they just are not able to feel those emotions, and that's what they mean. Sometimes it's about interpreting what the teenager is telling you. Um, what does that mean when you say you can't connect with any therapist? Is that what you're trying to say? It's just maybe asking a few more questions too about what it is that's feeling that way.
Right. And it sounds like from what I've read that they're really pushing pediatricians to get more into this, right, Dr. Rahman? And ask some of these questions of these kids, even just to maybe help steer them a little bit. So maybe a pediatrician could also help steer.
Absolutely. Yeah. So any trusted adult that the adolescent has known for a while and would listen to, it's sometimes just enough points of contact can steer you in the right direction. So yeah, if the child has a pediatrician that they're familiar with and would consent to at least going in and talking to them and discussing what to look for in a therapist and what, those kind of things can help too. Because yeah, you definitely don't want to be. This is not a question of forcing them. This is a question of accepting. Yeah, so that's important.
Okay, great. We got another question. How can you encourage how can parents help encourage their kids to feel connected when they're feeling disconnected from school or other places? What are things that we can help with? Because we're not there every day and we're trying to ask the right questions, but they always seem to come out wrong. Sorry, I'm adding my own editorial there, but
Appropriately so.
Mm-hmm.
I can answer to the 15-year-old version of it that happened to us was finding a community within the school that you feel connected to. So my son was able to find marching band, which helps him feel connected to the school. So those kind of things. But also I think participation from the family, the kids and the family matters. And so school communication, staying connected to, what's happening now, kind of keeping the family in the loop with what's happening at the school. There's also some other pieces that I know families do, but it gets much more important to stay connected to that. Sarah, do you have any other
And
thoughts?
I don't know if this is totally relevant, but the thought crossed my mind of this idea that like a career is a long thing, like a high school career is a long thing. And I think people get attached to, young people sometimes will get attached to this idea of like, it's supposed to look like this, or I'm supposed to be in this group, or I'm supposed to be playing this sport. And I think helping opening that up to like, maybe it doesn't have to look like what you thought it was going to look like, or maybe it's okay if it changes and you find yourself. But I think a lot of times like stuckness comes from this like inability to imagine it any other way, right? And so maybe some effort to like open up perspective, but like
yeah, that's great. Yeah, I have another question. What are you seeing in terms of perfectionism and anxiety, and in terms of like trying to always get straight A's, always worried about getting into college when you're in middle school? Do you have any general advice for that?
well, I'll go. That is like the bread and butter of what I see, which is why I'm chuckling a little bit. I'll share a little bit about my background and like relation to this, right? So I went to a very competitive prep school where it was very performance driven and highly competitive. And what kids go through today is astronomically more intense than what I went through. But I had a mentor very early on in high school who challenged me to think about my own metrics for success very wisely, I think. and sort of asked me to sit down and like think about not what I was being told would make me successful, but what were my actual things that I valued that had to do with success. And I think that those conversations need to happen more, because I think a lot of times the perfectionism is born out of fear, right? And the anxiety of not being good enough or not meeting somebody else's standards or being judged by somebody else's standards. And in that, I think young people lose sight of like their own ability to like gauge what their values are and gauge what their own standards are for themselves. So I think it's a really potent counterpoint to like, not to say that like quality and ambition, and if you want to shoot for excellence, like go do it, but reconnecting with also what is important to you, I think can counterweight that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'd like to add that sometimes the drive for perfectionism drives other behaviors. And the behaviors are harmful, which can be overscheduling, not getting enough sleep, sacrificing those things. So just like any other coping mechanism, perfectionism, like you said, is born of, yes, fear, but also maybe sometimes from a positive place of, I really want to excel well because this is supporting me in growing as a person. But sometimes it tips over into, so there's always a dark side of every positive, trait as well. And so understanding, having that conversation with every child that, have you slept? Have you eaten? Have you paid attention to your hydration? Are you rested? As parents, I think we can go a long way to just not doing it in a way of, intrusiveness, but just the importance of the foundational elements of sleep. Because I can't tell you, when I was seeing outpatient patients in Orange County when I first started in LA, I was astonished at 4 hours of sleep, 5 hours of sleep, maybe. And that's just for a developing brain. And then, you put the stresses of, the developing brain that actually needs more sleep. We're actually not just giving it not just giving it the normal amount of sleep, we're actually giving it even less sleep. So I think that has a lot to do with, and I think the social media, the 24/7 nature of that kind of impulse has also led to a worsening sleep pattern as well. And as we know, that impacts learning, that impacts impulsivity, that impacts just the ability to concentrate, and really just performance in school. So and then they just start to, and I know I hear this from the kids too, is this like kind of bravado about how little sleep I got. Have you heard that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's like a badge of honor. Yeah.
It's a badge of honor to not get enough sleep. So that's a cultural thing, right? Those are the kind of messages that can really be shaped by the adults around them, by the peers around them, that can be changed so that kids don't feel like they have to wear this badge of honor that's actually very detrimental to them.
Yeah, that reminds me, we had a challenge success committee last year and a couple of years before that at the school, and we did a student survey 2 years ago, and I think the average number of hours per night of sleep for the students that took the survey was 6. I think I'm being generous at 6.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
That was average. So this goes right into the question is next in my screen, which is, most kids nowadays say their phone gaming and screen timing is how they connect with other students. How and how much time should we limit their screen and phone time other than taking it out of their room when they sleep?
Yes. I don't know. Do you want to start, Simi, or do you want to start?
I think I can say that this is not just about the child, but also about the adults around us. We communicate with them using these phones. We know that there are positive and negative elements of these phones, but we also know that they have pretty deep impacts on us. So with that, I will just let Sarah, I think, walk the rest of that minefield.
Yeah.
So this have a more nuanced.
So this goes back to the Surgeon General's. I'm going to read a little bit from some of the stuff. So he says, this is the Surgeon General. The most common question parents ask me is social media safe for my kids? The answer is that we don't have enough evidence to say it's safe. And in fact, there's growing evidence that it is associated with harm to young people's mental health. And for too many children, social media use is compromising their sleep and valuable in-person time with family and friends. I think it's a fine line. There are two facts, right? The fact that it's ubiquitous and the fact that it has benefit. So the answer is not to shy away from it. I think the answer is to become friends with it, right? How you do that depends on your family and on your values. Some of the things that it has with the advisory are things like parents and caregivers can make plans in their households, such as establishing tech-free zones that better foster in-person relationships, teach kids about responsible online behavior and model that behavior, and report problematic content and activity. I agree with Simi, and ultimately it's a family issue. So like, if a parent is sitting on their phone, snapping at their kid to put their phone away, like it's not going to work, right? And I think it goes back to the like Bronfenner's like spheres of influence, right? Like the sphere is the family. So I don't know. I'm a fan of the like those Lucite boxes that you can lock and they have a timer on them. So if like there's meal time, everyone agrees, like agreements within the family, as opposed to like, it's not supposed to be punitive. It's not a punishment. This is an agreement in the family because it's a value-based decision that we value community time together to put the phones in and, start small, start 3 minutes. I don't know, start small. But I think it's
and
one
education
of those
things like Social Dilemma. You just reminded me of the movie Social Dilemma. If anybody has not watched it, that's a really good one to watch. Sorry, go ahead.
I don't know. I was gonna say like a lot of this I think gets at parenting. So where parents like, my kids are on the phone all the time. Like I'm such a bad parent. Or like, how am I ever gonna change this? Like like I think change starts small, right? It's small things and it's small little adjustments over time. And I think it's also looking.
Well, I don't know. I have no idea.
But that the pressure doesn't have to be to like make it all different all at once, right? The pressure, right? I think that can be counterproductive. I think more about trying to do small things over time consistently.
Yeah, absolutely. And having that dialogue so that we are all becoming self-aware, right? It's not like we are experts at this tech. This tech is coming on in real time and we're all learning and adapting to it. So modeling those good behaviors, but having those conversations about, even noticing things like, I remember noticing things like, oh, your mood swing, your mood gets really down after you've had a little too much video game time. What do you think about that? Like bringing up that self-awareness, because I think that's what this constant interaction with digital sphere makes us do, is you have to have a dialogue with yourself. Otherwise you can get completely lost in it, right? And that's the issue, is that with the developing brain, especially under 13 years of age, we can't be sure that they have that yet. Somebody told me, oh, my 3-year-old child can't sleep with if I take the screen out of their room. So they had to do a graduated removal of the screen outside of the 3-year-old's room, is because they had adapted, they had bonded to it. The kid had bonded to it just like it would have bonded to another person or a pet or something that, so remembering that these devices are very powerful and very sticky and designed to be sticky. And so treating them with respect comes, just like you would the car. Oh, you want the keys to the car? You've got to know how to drive it, and how to be safe with it and how to take care of yourself. And what are some of hard no's and what are some negotiables? Those kind of conversations.
Great. We do have a couple more questions. I am going to try and get us out of here in the next 5-ish minutes, especially so we can all care for our throats. Uh, so next one is, how can we help schools and teachers see how anxiety is affecting students, especially when these anxious kids don't want others to know how worried they are and internalize and hide their feelings? Oftentimes teachers don't know how severe their anxiety is because they're so good at hiding it.
Yeah. This is a tricky one. It is a thing that I come across very, very commonly in my practice, see very commonly clinically, especially high performing, high functioning children who have high verbal aptitudes. So they're able to compensate in lots of ways and cover up the anxiety. I think the street goes both ways. I think part of it may be educating teachers and other people in the schools that even if somebody is performing, that doesn't mean that they are not having symptoms. And I think also educating the child and family about ways to more appropriately be able to ask for help and reveal how to communicate and how to express their distress. Even though it may be hard, and even though that may be not the culture of the family they grew up in, or that it doesn't come naturally to them, because you can't, teachers and administrators aren't mind readers, and they can't, right? They can't. I think it's an unfair expectation to like think that they would develop the skills, the clinical skills to like be able to assess that necessarily. So I think maybe it's a little bit of both, like a little bit of learning on both sides.
Yeah, and almost like I want to say that anxiety is almost ubiquitous as well. So just keeping that as a baseline amount of knowledge that we all need to have. How do you decrease anxiety? Oh, you could do some mind body practices, doing some breath work can help, doing some exercise can help. Just knowing that that's just basic knowledge that everybody needs to know is how to calm your body. I think as a pediatrician, I start talking about that ability that you have to listen to your body and the ability you have to calm your body. And kids get it. So that kind of knowledge. And yeah, and I think with anxiety, knowing that the child is not going to even understand sometimes that they're anxious. Like if a child has lived all their life with anxiety, that's just become part of their personality, right? That's just who they are. But noticing things like, oh, are they having trouble resting to go to sleep? Do they have a hard time winding down? Do they let their anxiety kind of get the best of them, or are there like perseverations, are there patterns that are actually disturbing to them? Are there times where that they get kind of sick to the stomach? Sometimes they can have vague symptoms like headaches or some just belly aches and things like that, and just kind of listening, tuning in for that from both parents and teachers can be also useful.
Fantastic. So we do have a question I think is related to some of the stuff you're doing in private practice, which is what is the role of ketamine infusion? Is it regulated, and when to consider it for kids with depression? Should they just give you a holler?
Yeah. So I can speak to it from my perspective as a pediatric hospitalist doing conscious sedation at LA County for children who are admitted for bone marrow biopsies and LPs and broken bones and things. We would use ketamine all the time. And I never in all those years of my training, I didn't quite understand or didn't really connect that it had a psychedelic effect. And psychedelic meaning mind manifesting, which can look like hallucinations or basically having an experience of I'm not in this room, but I'm somewhere else. And that we know in adults can cause sometimes some, kind of frightening reactions coming out of ketamine. So those are the things that I kind of knew about ketamine. And then over the course of, researching into the antidepressant effect, noticing that it's really good at decreasing acute suicidality. And some of these like really has some immediate and some long lasting impacts. it really presents an opportunity to break through some stuck places in the brain when it comes to treatment-resistant depression and some other, diagnoses. But I think it's efficacious. That's why I kind of switched my practice to that. I think it could be really helpful. We know about the safety of ketamine in general in adults and children. So I think that's why, compared to all the other psychedelics that are coming out, it's the most well known in that way. When it comes to most widely used, it's on the top 50 WHO, drugs that are on the essential drugs list. And so from that perspective, it's really a good medication that can be delivered in the office. I think both of us are part of this group of physicians in the country and internationally who want to see this become part of the algorithm of general care of mental health disorders within this group, because there is such a need. And I'll stop there and I let Sarah contribute her part. Yeah.
Yeah. Was part of the question whether it's FDA approved?
Is it regulated?
Yeah, so it's a tricky story. So the only ketamine that's actually FDA approved for treatment-resistant depression is Sprayvato, which is it's S-ketamine, so it's one version of the molecule, and it's a nasal spray, and it's branded and it has a special delivery mechanism. The applications of intramuscular ketamine or IV infusion ketamine for treatment-resistant depression are not FDA regulated as such, so it's used off-label. Now, depending on how familiar you are with using things like we use things off-label all the time. Like it's not such a risky thing to do, especially when there is a really broad base of safety data. Like as Simi was saying, like ketamine has been used for decades and decades and decades in all sorts of different populations. And so I don't think it's being used off-label cavalierly. I think it's being used off-label with a lot of data to support its safety. But yeah, there's really, really promising results in smaller studies around suicidality, treatment-resistant depression, OCD, trauma-related symptoms. Generally, it's pretty well tolerated. It's not, I'll say this, like, I don't think it's for everybody, but I think for certain people in certain times with certain applications, it can make a huge difference.
Great. Thank you. I think I'm going to end with that. Thank you both so much for being here. This was such a wealth of knowledge, and it clearly fits into where our district is trying to go, and hopefully we can just keep that conversation going. So cannot thank you enough for all of your wisdom.